Hi, folks. Chris Voss here from the ChrisVossShow.com, the ChrisVossShow.com. Hey, we're coming to you here with another episode that we're doing. We're, of course, doing daily episodes now, or almost daily episodes on the Chris Voss Show. So be sure to give us a like, subscribe to us. We're doing these also live on Periscope, so thanks to you for joining. Also, check out our Patreon, where we're giving away all sorts of goodies, gadgets, all the sort of stuff that I get around the review universe of all the stuff that gets sent to us to review on the Chris Voss Show. So we're going to be doing a show today, a podcast. We're talking about Steely Dan. Walter Becker passed away yesterday at the age of 67. He was one of the co-founders, along with Donald Fagen, of Steely Dan. And I figured we'd reminisce today about Steely Dan, some of the things that it meant, some of the impacts it had in my life, and some of the difference it made. And hopefully some of our Periscope people or other folks will come in on the chat and kind of share some of maybe their stories, ideas, concepts, or questions. So we'll get into this. I've been a Steely Dan fan, I think around 10, 11, or 12. And I'll never forget, it was a defining moment in my life. I was growing up, I believe it would have been the 80s. The early 80s or the late 70s, and Steely Dan owned the FM radio. And when you grew up in my age, the FM radio was your musical life. They were just barely coming out with Walkman, so you really didn't have a way to take your personal music with you. You had LPs, you had 8-tracks that you could take with you in the car. They were just barely coming out with, they had cassettes, but they didn't have a way to really make those portable. So the Walkman was just barely coming out. And at that time, the Steely Dan were gods on the radio. It would seem like every other song was Steely Dan. Or Hall & Oates was very popular back then. Diana Ross, Michael Jackson, of course. They owned the FM radio. But I hadn't really made a connection to who Steely Dan was and what they were about. And my friend Steve N. Shelton came over. He's my blood brother from Boy Scouts as we grew up as kids together. He comes over and he goes, "Hey, man, you got to listen to this." And I believe we had a Walkman at that point in time, finally, because I remember my family was ultra religious. We had to sneak out of the house because we weren't allowed to listen to this type of music technically. And I went around to the side of our house where our chimney was. My dad had made this old brick chimney himself, and then he plastered cement over it. It was the ugliest looking thing on the outside. Inside it wasn't too bad. So we had this chimney. So we went out by the chimney. I'll never forget because we were standing out there, make sure no one from our family saw us. And he played for me I believe it's the album Dirty Work. And let me make sure I get these facts right because the old age tends to go away as we go. But it was the song Do It Again from the album, I believe, Dirty Work. And it was just so amazing to me. It just blew my mind at the time to hear it. And I was like, oh, and my friend's like, you got to check out this album. You got to check out this song. And I was like, okay, so that's what Steely Dan is. So after that, I started learning, listening to the FM radio. And just these songs were so precise and exact in the recording studio work that had been done on them. The one thing that Steely Dan was renowned for was when they first started out, they would have to do live shows, and they hated it. They just hated how the sound would come out. These guys were real perfectionists in the quality of sound, the quality of lyrics that they put into their work. Really super perfectionists. So after they finally achieved some record label success and selling records and doing well, they pretty much told the studio, hey, we're not doing touring anymore. We're just going to make really fucking great records. And that's what they did. So they sat down, and they were one of the first people who would spend tons of recording studio time, experimenting, bringing in different musicians. And they were really good at that. They were really good at layering their music, at bringing in different musicians to stand in. I forget what they call them, the studio musicians that will come in. And they would have them come in and try different things, throw it out, keep it, interlace it with everything they were doing. They were really good at it. I think the next sort of producer that went from that was, I forget his name, but it seems like it's Matt or Mike Mutt Lang. And Mutt Lang took that to the next level with Def Leppard. And I think there was some people he produced before that. But with Def Leppard, they just went hardcore, locked themselves in the studio for about a year or 2 years, and came out with Def Leppard's album Pyromania. And he became well known as this producer that would just, they'd lock themselves in the studio and just spend as much time as it took to make the most pristine record come out from front to back. And when you listen to some of the albums that Mutt Lange did, they are just pristine from front to back. Back then, they were doing a lot of the sort of hidden tracks at the end and doing sorts of different sort of intros that were kind of special and made the songs really unique. You heard a lot of that. I think just about every song on the Def Leppard Pyromania album has like all sorts of different intros or endings or just all sorts of different twists. And I believe there's a hidden track at the end where if you just let the thing play, the record play in the old days, it would come through with all this stuff. So those of you on Periscope who are watching, give us your thoughts on what we're going to be talking about. Steely Dan, Donald Fagen, Walter Becker. So I grew up listening I believe it was about 12 or 13. It seemed like it went through most of my teenage years to Steely Dan. They just owned the radio. They were always freaking on the radio. Every song, it seemed at the time off their albums, was being played on the radio. I mean, it was just complete inundation. They owned the irony of one of their songs they did called FM, which of course was a homage to FM radio, which they owned. And they would just keep going back in the studio and just keep making these incredible albums that when it comes to the quality that was put into them and making sure that everything was pristine when it came out the album. And each album, they just got better and better and better. Rest in peace, Walter Becker. I'm really sad about Steely Dan, Walter passing away so early. This last year, my dog had cancer. We spent 14 months with her in hospice care, and Steely Dan had just come, I think it was in April, to Las Vegas, and I really wanted to go, and I was so set on going, and we were just in a shit show of life. I had to move houses, my dog dying of cancer and taking care of her. It was just a really ugly, dark time, and so I put off the show going, you know what, they'll be here next year. They're young guys, they're going to live forever, blah, blah, blah. And this is the real sad thing about musicians. They tend to die early because they tend to have a really good time through life and burn out quick. That's what we expect of our rock and roll gods. So I am really bummed out about the whole thing. Really, really bummed out. And was really upset when I heard the news. Played Steely Dan all yesterday. He was only 67, yeah. Hey, how's it going, guys? Afternoon to you too. So, so one of the things I used to do when I was 12 or 13 is I used to build rockets. I used to get those Estes rockets. I don't know if you ever look them up, but if you Google Estes, they were renowned for making these rockets. They're really popular in the 80s. And you'd build them, glue them all together. You have to spend all this time making them. And then you would take them out to your local field, shoot them off into the sky, and hopefully not blow yourself up, burn them up. Hopefully you'd find them after they parachuted down. We lost several of them over the years. But the one thing I always remember was in my childhood, when we teenagedom, building these rockets. And I remember just the Steely Dan songs. And after that, I got all the tapes of the Steely Dan. About that time, they came out with the greatest hits. I remember buying it. It was the green box with like 4 discs in it, I think. And it had their whole catalog from kind of a little bit before Dirty Work and then on through Gaucho. And I remember there's been very few times, because I'm very musically oriented and audio oriented. I at one time had like about 4,000 CDs on top of the growing digital collection that I had. And so I've always loved music and quality recordings, quality sound. So I got the Steely Dan stuff. And one of the things about it was the lyrics were so, what's the right word I'm looking for? Empirical? They just had this magic about the lyrics, and the music was just so beautiful. You try and sing through the lyrics, but you wouldn't even know what the fuck you were singing or talking about, because they were so kind of detailed and magical and mystical, and I think etherical is the right word that I want to take and use. Is that etherical the right word I want to use, people? They just had this texture to them and this detail that was, it wasn't your average Joe singing about how he lost his girlfriend and his girlfriend left him and he loves her and misses her and blah, blah, blah. There was something that you were like, I really need to go down and sit down and figure out what these lyrics were. But the music was just so encapsulating and so incredible that you would just be lost in the music, and it would stick in your head. And it took me years to even sit down and go, what do these songs mean? Like, what is he writing about? What is all this crap I'm singing? And Steely Dan just had that magic. I can think of very few albums in all my life where I was so encapsulated and so overtaken with the music that it took me years, and after hundreds of plays of the music, to finally sit down and go, what are these songs about? What am I singing? What was the story behind this? And there you go, the U.S. Air Force. That probably made some great times for you. So their music had that power. There were some Black Sabbath albums that had that power where I listened to them for years and then finally sat down with them. In fact, it was like over a decade before I ever sat down and said, what does this Steely Dan song mean? Like, what the why did this get written, and what is it about? And even 2 decades later, I've finally been sitting down with Wiki over the years and going, what did this mean? Again, what were they writing about? What is what are some of the things that are in there? Kid Charlemagne. What was that reference about? What were Walter Becker and Donald Fagen writing about? What was all that yickety yak going on? I think one of the things I always wondered about was, I think it's in the song Black Cow. There's a reference to a pillbox or something, and I forget what it's called in the song, but I'm trying to remember the line here. I can't quite place it. Maybe it'll come to me. But the one of each surely will weed out the sorrow. It's like a pillbox. I forget what it's. I want to call it a doppelganger. I have this stuck in my head, so I can't think of what it really is. But yeah, rock poetry. That's really what these guys did. They really made rock poetry, but then they took the music, and it's so pristine. There's $7,000 worth of speakers sitting here. There's some teal speakers in the back. They're $4,000 a piece. I'll pan around so you can see those. I've got a beautiful JBL subwoofer here, big JBL 590 BKs. Hopefully you'll be able to see those. I don't know. So I'll just pan around. You can see them in some of the other videos that we have. We'll pan around here. So these 2 Thiel bookshelf speakers, I believe they're TM3s. They're $4,000 for the 2 of them. And then I think the subwoofer is $1,000. Here's these are $1,000 a piece. My BK 590s. You probably saw them on the video we did yesterday, where I was jamming to them and really enjoying the Steely Dan library and going through it and everything. Trying to pick your most favorite Steely Dan song is a nightmare. I actually sat down. Thank you. I actually sat down yesterday and was trying to pick the number one, my most favorite, my most played Steely Dan song. It is the most hardest thing in the world, because I'd be like, okay, well, Dr. Wu is my favorite. I love Dr. Wu. Musically, it's not quite as precise and perfected as some of the other ones. It's actually a little more simpler, less complex, but I like the words. And there's some different meanings that apply to me. And that was the interesting thing too about Steely Dan lyrics is they had that, because of that empirical quality, the mystical sort of quality they had behind them that weren't hard to find, weren't simple to find. You could easily take some of your experiences in life towards towards examples of you. Like for me, a lot of the lyrics in Dr. Wu has as I equate in my interpretation of it, even though that's not what they were meant in their writing, but that's the beauty of great lyrical music, is you interpret it in your way and it internalizes and becomes important to you for what the meaning it gives you, even though that may not have been what the meaning was really about or why the writer wrote it. But that's the magic of the music and the lyrics. So Dr. Wu has a powerful meaning to me that I've created for myself, about a girlfriend who comes back to me, comes back into my life, and all that sort of good stuff. I don't think it has anything to do with that, from what I understand about Dr. Wu. I think it's mostly a drug song, and I'm not sure which drugs it's about. But it's interesting how their music was always that way. You could take it and you can kind of make it your own and everything else. But just the preciseness of the music, just being able to listen to it for hours on end, hearing the different stuff. And what's nice is I have superior quality speakers, great audio equipment from Harman Kardon. I've got some Master and Dynamic headphones here, which are some of the most, I believe, consumer brand. These are some of the best headphones you can get, masterdynamics.com. Deacon Blues is one of my favorite. That was probably one of my early on as a kid favorite songs from that catalog, because I dealt with a lot of depression. I dealt with a lot of darkness. And Deacon Blues just had a great way of dealing with it. I grew up being kind of that loser kid, or felt like you were a loser in my teenage years, and darkness and depression, and trying to go through what Rush documents in their subdivisions growing up in this societal high school of trying to make your way through it all and find your identity, and dealing with all this abuse and all this stuff that ultimately ends up shaping you one way or another. So that was Hey 19 was one of my favorite songs early on. I remember Ricky Don't Lose That Number. Ricky Don't Lose That Number. They played the hell out of that song on the radio. Ricky Don't Lose That Number. That thing probably, I don't know if that got the most airplay. I think Reelin' in the Years did as well. And then there were other songs that I wasn't that familiar with. Peg didn't really start coming around till later in the years. I never heard My Old School till I bought the greatest hits and started listening to the albums. Black Cow, of course, was really popular on the radio. Deacon Blues, Peg, Fire in the Hole. I never heard Fire in the Hole until I started listening to like the B-sides, if you will. So trying to find the number one song was just crazy yesterday, because we'd be like, okay, you know what? Okay, I'm going to go play Dr. Wu. Okay, I love Dr. Wu. And then I'm like, hold on, I love Peg. Peg's really awesome. And then Home at Last is really a great song for me. And it's one of the songs that I use when I test out audio equipment here on the Chris Voss Show, whether it's speakers, whether it's headphones. Home at Last has this interesting tracks to it, and it has this layering that's real important. And one of the things I listened to, and Steely Dan really taught me this, was learning to listen to the layers of the tracks in the music, and being able to have great audio equipment that can present those layers to you and not blend them all together, not push them together as one sound where they just, here you go, is really important. The Master and Dynamic MW40s, or MD40s, MW40s, these Thiels, my great JBL speakers. There's some Bluetooth headphones that I really like from, will come to me a bit, the P7s for Bowers & Wilkins. And they're really good at getting those layers and presenting them to you. And the really true test of great music that's well recorded, that's well engineered, well produced, because that's also impacts it, is being able to hear those layers where, and do this if you can when you go home at night and listen to Steely Dan. Turn on the lights, close your eyes, put on whatever your equipment is, your audio equipment is, and just try and listen to like the guitar piece through the whole song, and just focus your brain on the guitar piece. Focus your brain on the keyboards. Focus your brain on like the drum fills, how the drums are being used. what they're taking and doing. And Steely Dan has those aspects of it when you listen to recordings where you can focus on the individual tracks, if you will. One of the things I love about Home at Last is there's this bass kind of fill to it, this vroom, vroom, vroom. That's about the only way to explain it because I'm not a bassist or a bass technician. But if you go listen to the song, if you listen to the right speakers, you'll hear this bass movement. It's not really sort of it's kind of a vroom, vroom, yeah. You'll hear the bass, kind of this moan of the bass, if you will. And it really impacts the song. And unless you listen to like Home at Last through really good speakers, we're not going to hear that. At the end of Home at Last, you can kind of hear like, I don't know if it's a kazoo or one of those little pianos that you would blow through, or one of just the little Tinker kids pianos, but you can kind of hear it fade out as it goes out through Home at Last. And I think there's pieces of it through the song. So I love Home at Last. Home at Last will pull me right into the groove. Peg's a big favorite. But let's read, Spotify's a good way to tell what the top songs are for everyone. Reeling in the Years is number 1 on Spotify, 24 million plays. Do It Again. These are all from Dirty Work. Do It Again as the number 2 spot. Dirty Work is number 3. Deacon Blues is number 4. I think it's a very popular song with a lot of people. Peg is number 6, and I skipped over Ricky, Don't Lose That Number, at number 5. My Old School at number 7. Black Cow at number 8. Fire in the Hole at number 9, which is kind of surprising. And Hey 19. Excuse me. It's like a yawn of dead air time. Sorry about that. Excuse me, folks. So what's your guys' favorite Steely Dan song? If you're watching me on Periscope right now, put it up. If you're on YouTube, put in the comments your favorite Steely Dan song, or maybe your top 5, top 10 list, top 3 list. But they had so many great songs. And sitting down and looking at their lyrics, pouring all over them, and the lyrics are so detailed. Like some of the even terms they use in their lyrics, I had to go look up on Wikipedia. Like, what does that mean? In fact, Kid Charlemagne has some references, if I recall rightly, in it. Black Cow. Let's look at Black Cow. I'm trying to remember what the lyric reference is in Black Cow that I had to go look it up and go, what is going on? The Black Cow lyrics. I don't know why they didn't pull it up the first time for me. I got Wikipedia on it. And your remedies, one of each will screen out the sorrow. Where was the thing? There's a reference down to Green Street. There you go. Looking so outrageous. I can't remember what the reference was, but it looks like I have the wrong song. So anyway, that's the biggest problem with liking this new Twitter comment site thing going on. Cool. So anyway, just all the different things that they would reference in their music and their lyrics and what they were about, and then going back and reading them. Mr. Chow's, of course, reference to the famous popular Hollywood restaurant that everyone likes to go be seen at and everything else. Looking up what some of this stuff meant, what it was about, thinking about the what was going on in Hollywood in the 70s and the lifestyle back then, and kind of capturing that whole feel of the lifestyle of the Southern California in the 70s and early 80s, what that was about. They were just so good at going into it. Every album just seemed to get better. Asia seems to be one of the most favorite albums. It seemed like everybody I knew who had albums back then always had Asia. You go over to people's house, you'd always find the Asia album. You always look at it, just there was a mysteriousness about the Asia album. You know, you had the Asian woman who was kind of there, but she's kind of not there, faded out. And you're always like, what does this mean? And is it have something to do with Asia? Or is it Asia? Or why did they name it that? You know, there was just this endless thing. And of course, we grew up in that area where you'd have the album and you have this giant piece of artwork that you would get to look at. That's one of the other things I was really bummed out about. I got thinking, shit, I don't have any Steely Dan collectible stuff. I don't have any albums anymore. I got rid of everything and moved it all digital. And I think sadly, the only thing you can really get on FLAC files is the album Gaucho. For some reason, you cannot get the other albums on FLAC. I believe I have, and this is what's really bummed me out. I used to have all the master disc gold CDs, the ones you pay like $25 for back in the day. And I used to have all those of the Steely Dan collection. And I sold them all when I went digital, and I made a pretty good buck off them. So I went online to see if I could get me some Steely Dan albums and some Steely Dan maybe collectibles really quick after I heard he died. Holy crap, the price has gone through the freaking roof. It's like super expensive. Like everybody wants it now. So there's that. But I'm probably what I'm thinking I'm going to do, because the great thing about Steely Dan is there's not a lot of albums you have to really buy. They didn't put out like a lot of albums like, say, Rush or the Rolling Stones or something. There's a lot of stuff that you can take and get without spending a lot of money, because they just didn't have that big of a library, and they didn't have to, because like everything was #1 hits. I wonder how many #1 hits. How many #1 hits, or should we go top? How many top 10 hits did Steely Dan? Let's take a look at this. Steely Dan, the top 10 Steely Dan songs. Greatest Steely Dan songs, official chart history by the Official Charts Company. Let's see here. Singles, they had 10 weeks in the top 20, 21, Steely Dan, Do It Again. Peak position was 39, 17 for Haitian Divorce. FM, 49. Ricky Don't Lose That Number, 58. I'm not sure how accurate some of this is. Albums, let's see here. Albums, Pretzel Logic, not sure how much this is really telling us. Asia, of course, looks like was one of their top. Steely Dan Gold was very big. Reeling in the Years, that's not an album. Live in America, A Decade of Steely Dan was like #1. Everything Must Go. You know, the other thing is too, is I really kind of did not appreciate the Two Against Nature and Everything Must Go albums. I really just didn't get into it, maybe because it wasn't the airplay, or maybe because I felt they had changed. But now that I've gotten really great speakers from really great systems, turns out Two Against Nature was really incredibly well produced. And actually a lot of reviewers like me use Two Against Nature's song, trying to think of the song that was on Two Against Nature. It's just a great song for testing out albums. Katie lied, that was such a great album. Two Against Nature, it's the album Jack of Steely Dan. Jack of Speed. Jack of Speed from Steely Dan. If you want to test out your speakers or test out your headphones, check out Steely Dan's Jack of Speed song. Just an immaculate song, beautifully produced from front to back, very sharp song. And it's going to bring out all the different elements of your speakers and everything else. A lot of great audiophiles use that song, and a lot of Steely Dan songs I use. Home at Last is one of them. Peg is a big one that I'll use when I'm testing speakers. Just the sound quality and sharpness of their recording was just amazing. And so what can you say? Donald Fagen, I hope he keeps the music alive. I hope he keeps going. He stated in his note that he put out with the two of them. And some of the stories of them are pretty funny when you go back and read some of the different things they did. They were kind of like the nerds of the music business. They loved drugs, and they were kind of the nerds of the music business. I mean, they did look the part in the 70s of having all this interesting stuff in the look of the stuff, but they were just these nerds that were into just making great music instead of like snorting coke, putting out some shit on an album and going and recording and putting it out there. You know, the Rolling Stones in the late 70s and early 80s got into this vibe that was one of the things that actually, in my opinion, started to ruin music and brought us to the fall of it, was where they would just put one or two hits on an album and then the rest was B-side filler crap no one ever wanted or listened to. And they'd sell you an album at top dollar. And that was the thing that really started pissing consumers off, where they would put out these albums where they would mostly just be these junky B-sides that were just awful. And there was really 1-2 solid hits on it, maybe one, and maybe a third one get radio play if you're lucky. So it was interesting that way. One thing that was interesting about Donald Fagen's statement on Walter Becker passing away, he made the statement, Walter had a very rough childhood. I'll spare you the details. Luckily, he was smart as a whip, excellent guitarist, and great songwriter. He was cynical about human nature, including his own, and hysterically funny. So he had great insight. Like a lot of kids from fractured families, he had the knack of creative mimicry, reading people's hidden psychology and transforming what he saw into a bubbly, incisive art. His habits got the best of him by the end of the 70s, and we lost touch for a while. That's kind of an interesting thing that he put into a statement that made me kind of go, why didn't he put that in there? They haven't come out and said what happened to Walter. I would imagine he maybe had a heart attack, old age, organs giving out. He may have just gone on a final coke binge, like the bassist from The Who did here in Las Vegas. And that's just, you just come to a point where you just can't party and tour anymore, and your body goes, no, we're not doing that. So pretty interesting. He made that notation. It's going to be interesting to hear what did Mr. Becker in, sadly. But just an interesting time of what they grew up in: Chicago blues, soul music, jazz. That was the great thing about that was the fusion. The jazz fusion was the great thing about Steely Dan. We think of it defined as pop music, where really what they were doing was making fusion jazz music and just mixing it all together with this steaming rock and pop and jazz and everything else into it. So it was pretty interesting. It was like it was unreal and like anything you heard at the time, and it was incredibly produced, like the Beatles were. And what's interesting is they did most of their own stuff. And if you listen to the Steely Dan records, especially going back to some of the early stuff that isn't as popular before Dirty Work, in fact, you can really go back into their thing if you get some of the bootlegs and things of some of their early stuff. Until they started producing their own music, it just really wasn't done well. So it's interesting to see their journey if you go way, way back. You can do some of that through their greatest hits, best of thing, which is really cool. So anyway, put in comments if you're watching this on Periscope. Be sure to give us a like, subscribe to us on there. I guess I'll quit pontificating about Steely Dan. I just really love him. Very sad that Walter Becker died, and I'm looking forward to the next concert that rolls through town with Donald Fagen and hopefully the old band from Steely Dan, whatever they had around them. I'm really looking forward to enjoying that and reminiscing about those old times. In fact, I probably won't ever miss a Steely Dan concert ever again. So if you're a Steely Dan fan, be sure to leave a comment below in the YouTube videos. Love to know what your top songs are you thought. What your remembrances and memories were of Steely Dan. Be sure to give us a like, subscribe to us on YouTube. Be sure to also join our Patreon at patreon.com/Chris Voss. You can actually, if you sign up over there, get into private Facebook groups that we have. We're actually giving away all the different goodies that come to us from the Chris Voss Show. And you can enter to win those. You can also be involved in the show, have a chance to be on the Chris Voss Show. Be sure to watch this coming week. I think we have about 6 or 7 shows lined up on the schedule, almost 2 a day of people that want to come on the show, talk to us about what they're doing, and it's pretty much wide open. If you think you want to be on the Chris Voss Show, you have a book, you have a speaking thing or something you like to do or share, that you think would be compelling to our audience, we'd love to have you on the show. So hit me up, email me, contact me, and let's chat about it. Anyway, thanks to everyone for tuning into the show. Be sure to subscribe so that you get notifications. Hit the notification button on YouTube and Periscope so you see our broadcasts and all that good stuff. Thank you once again for tuning in. God bless Steely Dan. And wow. It'd be interesting. Here's an interesting side thought note at the end. What if there's all mess of work that they can go back in and refix up that never got published and might get published by Donald Fagen here as Steely Dan stuff that never, they confirm up and get out? That would be kind of interesting. But I think my guess would be these guys are such perfectionists, they never would release that sort of those songs. I don't know. You never know. Never say never. Anyway, thanks for tuning in, guys. Appreciate you. We'll see you next time.